Hey everyone, my name is Carson Whitenauer, and I serve as the executive director for Uncommon Pursuit, where a community of men and women from all around the world is being transformed by God for God's mission. And you can find us at uncommonpursuit.net. But enough about me and enough about Uncommon Pursuit. Today, we are tackling a critical topic. Do the Gospels in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, do they tell us the truth? Because if the Gospels are accurate records of God becoming a human being, that is big news. That's worth talking about. That is worth investigating and knowing and being changed by. But if this is mythology, science fiction, fantasy novels, a bunch of hogwash, then we need to stop having anyone in the world, live their lives based on these documents. And so the question, do the Gospels tell us the truth, is a critical question. It's one that shapes geopolitics, it shapes lives of families and individuals all around the world. Christianity is the world's largest religion, and a lot of it is because people think that the Gospels are true. And so that's the question for today. And I am going to grill Dr. Jonathan McLatchie today and see what he has to say about the Gospels. And if you don't feel that I have been sufficiently skeptical or even cynical or tough on Dr. McClatchy, you can come and grill him yourself. Dr. McClatchy is the founder of talkaboutdoubts.com. It's a ministry I love being a part of myself. And what Jonathan has done is he's gathered a bunch of friends who are true experts in a variety of different subjects, and they have made themselves available completely for free to talk with anyone who has sincere questions about Christianity. So, Jonathan is someone who really cares and has a compassion for someone who's doubting or struggling with or troubled about Christianity, but wants to press in and seek out the truth. And so, Jonathan, welcome to the Uncommon Pursuit community. Thank you for being with us here today. I want to invite you, introduce yourself, share with us some of your background, your passions, and from your heart, like, why does this question matter so much to you?
Yeah, thank you so much, Carson, for having me on. Great to be with you. I I live in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm an assistant professor here at a Christian college called Sattler College. I teach biology, um, and I'm also a fellow of the Discovery Institute. And I have a long-standing interest in questions of religious epistemology and the reliability of the New Testament, the evidence for miracles, especially the resurrection of Jesus, and the evidence for not just the existence of God, but also for the revelation of God in the person of Jesus Christ and through the Jewish and Christian scriptures that we call the Bible. And so, as you mentioned, I launched this website, talkaboutdoubts.com, last year in December. Although I'd been doing this sort of work going back to 2016 on my personal site, where it was just me doing these calls. But now we have assembled a team of more than 60 scholars and experts in various subjects who are willing to do one-on-one private mentoring sessions with Christians that are struggling with doubts about their faith. We also have a growing, vibrant Discord community, and we have weekly Zoom hangouts on Thursday nights, as well as a monthly panel Q&A session with some of our experts. So if you are struggling with doubts about your faith, then please feel free to reach out to us at talkaboutdoubts.com, and one of our team will be in touch with you to set up a call. As for the credibility of the New Testament, the the importance of the subject, I think, is its epistemic relevance to the case for Jesus' resurrection from the dead. The way that I would approach building the case for Jesus' resurrection would be to argue that the Gospels and Acts actually reflect the unembellished testimony of those who are purportedly eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection. And that being the case, we have to give an account of why they made the sort of claims that they did concerning the resurrection of Jesus. And when we study the nature or variety of the resurrection encounters in the Gospels, we find that they are not talking about just individual sightings at a great distance and very briefly or something like that, but rather they are group encounters with Jesus, group conversations with Jesus, long discourses with Jesus, like the Emmaus disciples and the disciples on the road to Emmaus. They involve eating with Jesus on more than one occasion. In Luke 24, Jesus eats broiled fish in the presence of the disciples. In John 21, they eat breakfast with Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. According to according to the Gospels, also was involved physical contact. According to Acts 1, it was extended across a 40-day time period, so it's not a brief, confusing episode. And so, it's a sort of set of testimonial claims about which it's very difficult to be honestly mistaken. And then when you examine the context of the apostles' claims concerning the resurrection, we quickly discover that there's a context of persecution whereby the early apostles, those who were purportedly eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection, undertook tremendous risks in proclaiming the resurrection and in adhering to Christian precepts. In fact, the early apostles were voluntarily willing to endure sufferings, labors, dangers, hardships, persecutions, in some cases martyrdom, on account of their conviction of Christ's resurrection. And that goes a long way towards establishing that they were at least sincere in making that claim. And the context of persecution can be established from the Book of Acts, from the letters of Paul, from First Clement, and other sources. And so if we can establish then that it's enormously implausible that the apostles were lying, and it's enormously implausible that they were honestly mistaken, the best explanation then, or the most probable explanation, is that Jesus in fact rose from the dead. And so the crucial aspect of that case would be whether what we have in the Gospels and Acts actually does reflect the unembellished testimony of those who are purportedly eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection. And so then that's where the case for the robust reliability of the Gospels and Acts comes in to bolster that crucial premise in the argument.
So, yeah, I mean, if I tell somebody I had a meal with my family, for instance, it's unlikely to that I could get that kind of detail wrong. That's a very visceral, experience, and certainly the sincerity of the persecution. That also, if you're willing to not gain money and fame and sex and power, but you're actually getting beaten and imprisoned and losing important relationships, yeah, that does tend to make you think, well, they might be wrong, but they really think it's true. So I see your points there. But let's go to a really basic question. What are the Gospels? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Some people would say they are mythology. They are the result of a long game of telephone. They are fantasy novels. They're science fiction. I suppose you're going to say they're biographies. What genre, what kind of documents are these four gospels? And more particularly, how do you come to that conclusion? Why do you think that's the case?
I think the best approach to understanding the Gospels is that they are historical memoirs of Jesus' life, ministry, death, and resurrection. I think that there's overwhelming evidence spanning multiple different categories that establishes with a high level of confidence that the Gospels and Acts are composed by individuals who are close up to the facts, well informed, and habitually scrupulous. And that would include both internal lines of evidences as well as external lines of evidence, where you have extra biblical sources that corroborate and confirm the Gospels or Acts in often very indirect and undesigned and artless ways that actually supports the credibility of those accounts. So I would consider the historical reportage model as being the best model for making sense of the data we have pertaining to the Gospels.
Okay, so we're going to try and get into some of that historical reportage and look at the evidence for that in this conversation. My next question is, if they're historical reports, I expect when I read a newspaper or watch a TV broadcast or what have you, that I'm going to know the reporter's name. There's going to be a real person behind this story who has been on the ground, investigated the details, is reporting live, has been on the scene and knows what's happening. So, the Gospels, how do we know who wrote these documents?
Yeah, so it's often pointed out that the Gospels are anonymous formally. They don't contain the names of the individuals to whom they are attributed, at least in the text of those Gospels. And so, by a formal definition, the Gospels are anonymous writings. But that wasn't particularly uncommon in the ancient world. I mean, First Clement, for example, was also technically an anonymous writing in that Clement doesn't sign his name in the text. I mean, presumably the letter would have bore his name. It would have been written on the papyrus upon which the letter was written. It would have been written upon the scroll, but it wasn't. It's not written in the text, and the reason we know that Clement wrote it is because Irenaeus tells us. He gives a description of a letter that matches what we have in First Clement and mentions that Clement of Rome wrote it. We there's also I mean, the Gospel of Luke, for example, when in the prologue of the Gospel of Luke, we find that it's addressed to a guy called Theophilus, and we don't really know who Theophilus was, but it appears to be some sort of official, and so presumably Theophilus would know who was writing to him, right? Just as the Corinthians would have known who was writing the letter to them from Clement of Rome, and so it seems to me to be very plausible that the name of the relevant author would have been on the scroll, even if it's not written in the actual text itself. Um, and um, so so yeah, I don't think that the argument from the formal anonymity of the Gospels is particularly strong, and there's also evidence, both internal and external, that tends to suggest quite strongly, in fact, the traditional authorship of the Gospels and Acts. So, for example, Luke is purportedly a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. I say purportedly because from Acts 16 and following, he uses the inclusive plural pronoun we to describe his journeys with the Apostle Paul. And that's been, I mean, the most face value interpretation, and indeed the majority scholarly view on that, is that this is best understood as indicating that the author is at least claiming to have been a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. Whether he was or not is another question. But, and then also in the prologue of Luke chapter 1, he claims that he received information from eyewitnesses, uh, either from written sources or from people he's interviewed or spoken with. And when we read in Acts 21, the we passages become significant because in Acts 21, Paul meets with the elders of the Jerusalem church. Luke tells us that all of the elders are present, including James. And so Luke, therefore, if he was indeed a traveling companion of Paul, he had access to those who were purportedly eyewitnesses to Jesus' life, ministry, death, and resurrection. Of course, Luke, if the wee passages are to be believed, was present with Paul during his 2-year imprisonment in Caesarea Maritima, which is close to Jerusalem also. And so he would have had ample access to those witnesses to Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And so, uh, as to as for establishing that the author was indeed a traveling companion of Paul, there's numerous lines of evidence that one could look at, both internal and external. One internal line of evidence is, so in Acts 16, the we passages, as Craig Keener points out, actually trail off when Paul goes through Philippi. And then you don't see any more we passages until chapter 20, when Paul goes back through Philippi. And so it seems to imply that the author had actually remained behind in Philippi and rejoined Paul when Paul went back through Philippi. There's also various indications that the author of Luke Acts was very, very intimately acquainted with Paul's travels. Either he had spoken to Paul directly about about Paul's travels, or he was in fact with Paul during those travels. So an example of that would be, so in 1 Corinthians 4, and verse 17. So Paul is writing from from Ephesus in Asia Minor to the Christians in Corinth in Greece. And in verse 17, he says, "That's why I sent you Timothy, my beloved and faithful child in the Lord, to remind you of my ways in Christ." And so at the time of his writing from Ephesus to Corinth, around the year 53 or thereabouts, he'd already sent Timothy on his way from Ephesus to Corinth. He uses the past tense there. That's why I sent you Timothy. So in chapter 16, And verse 10, interestingly, it says, when Timothy comes, see that you put him ease among you, for he's doing the work of the Lord as I am. And so one might wonder, well, how does this make sense? He's already sent Timothy on his way, but he somehow expects his letter to arrive in Corinth before Timothy gets there. Now, when we turn over to, so we'd infer, I think, that the most plausible way of putting those together would be that Timothy must have taken some less direct route to Corinth than that taken by the letter. And of course Ephesus and Corinth were across the Aegean Sea from one another, and so the most obvious way to send a letter in those days would be by boat over the Aegean Sea. And we'd infer then that Timothy must have taken the indirect overland route going up through Troas and Macedonia on his way around to Corinth. Now, when turning to Acts 19, verse 21 and 22, we find that that's exactly what happens. This is when they were in Ephesus. It says, after these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia, that's where Corinth is, of course, and go to Jerusalem, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. And having sent into Macedonia two of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. So Paul remains behind in Ephesus, in Asia, and he sends Timothy along with Erastus up through Macedonia, exactly as you would predict from those very subtle clues in 1 Corinthians. But notice here that it doesn't even mention Corinth as Timothy's destination. It's very, very indirect. And then look at chapter 20. In chapter 20, it says, after the uproar ceased, this is after the riot at Ephesus, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, he said farewell and departed for Macedonia. When he had gone through these regions and had given them much encouragement, he came to Greece. There he spent 3 months. That's actually when he wrote Romans, during that 3 month stint in Greece, in the city of Corinth. There he spent 3 months, and when a plot was made against him by the Jews, as he was about to set sail for Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. Sopater the Berean, son of Pyrrhus, accompanied him, and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus, Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy. So Timothy evidently did make it to Corinth, exactly as you would predict from those clues in 1 Corinthians. But just notice how indirect that connection is. But it gets even better than that, because if you look back at Acts 19 and verse 22, who's Timothy's traveling companion on the way round to Corinth? It's Erastus. Who's Erastus? Well, Romans 16, whom I mentioned, was written during that 3 month stint in Corinth, in Greece. Uh, Erastus is mentioned in Romans chapter 16, where it says, Erastus, the city treasurer, greets you. And so he was the city treasurer of Corinth. He's also mentioned in 2 Timothy 4, where it says Erastus remained at Corinth. So it's quite fitting then that Timothy on his way around to Corinth would be accompanied by a guy who actually is from that city of Corinth. And so the pieces all fit together in exactly the way you would expect of Acts is composed by someone who is in a position to be intimately acquainted with Paul's adventures, Paul's travels. So that's an example of an internal line of evidence for Luke being a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. There's also external confirmation. So an example of that would be, so in Acts 27, of course, you have Paul's shipwreck, his fateful voyage to Rome to face trial, and it ends, unfortunately, in shipwreck. And Acts 27 tells us, so they get loaded onto this Alexandrian grain ship, and they're headed and they're sailing past the island of Crete, and they're trying to traverse from one end of the island of Crete to the other. And it says that soon a tempestuous wind called the northeaster struck down from the land. Now there is actually a well-confirmed wind that rides from the northeast over Crete, and it happens to be strongest at this exact time, around the time of Passover. And was particularly interesting is that the Isle of Cauda, to which, according to Acts, to get blown, is precisely where the trajectory of the northeaster ought to have carried them from the Bay of Massara, which is where the storm was likely caught the travelers. And it's not the sort of information that one could have inferred reasonably without having been blown there. You know, the ancients found it nearly impossible to locate the presence of islands, the physical location of islands that far out, that far off coast. In fact, Ptolemy and the Encyclopedist Pliny the Elder had the estimates in Luke's day as to where the Isle of Cauda was located, and both contradict Luke, but both get it wrong, and Luke's account alone is the only account that actually gets the implied location of the Isle of Cauda correct. And so that again bodes favorably for the reliability of Acts, and it being written by someone who was in fact a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. So there's a lot more to say on that. In fact, Craig Keener has a great four-volume commentary on the Book of Acts. Colin Heemer also has a great book called The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History, if you're interested in the external confirmations. In fact, there's a whole book written on the evidence for Paul's shipwreck in Acts 27. It's by a guy called James Smith, called The Voyage and Shipwreck of St. Paul. So I also highly recommend that. On the internal evidences, I recommend Lydia McGrew's book, Hidden in Plain View. Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts, as for even more examples, there's a book by William Paley called Hora Paulinae, which is translated from the Latin title. It means the times of Paul. So that sort of evidence then is very consistent with Luke being the author of Luke Acts, because Luke, in fact, was a traveling companion of Paul, and you can actually argue that it was probably him by process of elimination, in fact. And we know that Luke, according to the prison epistles like Colossians and Philemon, Luke is present with Paul during Paul's Roman imprisonment, and so that suggests that that's also consistent with Luke, in fact, being this individual, because the author of Luke Acts clearly was present with Paul on that voyage and for Paul's first Roman imprisonment. So that's Luke. As for John, so John actually, so I mentioned that Luke claims to have spoken to eyewitnesses, or at least received information from eyewitnesses in his prologue of his gospel. John actually claims directly to be an eyewitness. So, for example, everyone agrees essentially that First John, whoever wrote John's gospel, also wrote First John, even if that wasn't John. So in First John, we read in the prologue, "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we looked upon, and have touched with our hands, concerning the word of life. The life was made manifest, and we have seen it, and testified to it, and proclaimed to you the eternal life, which was with us, which was with the Father, and was made manifest to us. That which we have seen and heard we proclaim also to you, so that you too may have fellowship with us, and indeed our fellowship is with the Father, and with his Son Jesus Christ. And we are writing these things so that our joy may be complete." And so that seems to strongly suggest that the author of John's Gospel, whom we take to be the same as First John for a number of different reasons, is claiming to be an eyewitness to Jesus' ministry. Now, you could try to interpret this as speaking about humanity more broadly, saying that we as humanity have that the life was manifest, and we, namely mankind, has seen it and testified to it and proclaimed to you. But notice though that it makes the distinction between us and you, right? The life was made manifest, and we have seen it and testified to it and proclaimed to you the eternal life, which was with the Father, and it was manifest to us. That which we have seen and heard, we proclaim also to you, so that you too may have fellowship with us. And so it seems that the most face value interpretation there is that he's claiming to be an eyewitness. Furthermore, in John chapter John chapter 20, John chapter 20, John chapter 21, verse 24, it speaks concerning the beloved disciple, and it says, this is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things, and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. Now, there are some arguments among scholars that, so Bart Ehrman, for example, will say that this is actually saying the opposite of John being an eyewitness. He'll say that this is actually saying John was not an eyewitness, because it says, this is a disciple, speaking about in the third person. This is a disciple who's bearing witness about these things, and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. So who's we? Evidently, we is being distinguished from the beloved disciple. Now, the interpretation I think is most plausible is that this is similar to what you have in Romans 16. I think it's verse 23, if I recall. It's in in Romans 16, where Paul's secretary, who wrote this letter, sends greetings. It's verse 22. "I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, greet you in the Lord." And so that it's quite plausible then that in John 21 is John's secretary, his scribe, who is distinguishing himself from the beloved disciple. And it seems there's tons of internal evidences that John was in fact an eyewitness, and so that's consistent with his claim to have been the beloved disciple. If you want a good book on this topic, The Eye of the Beholder by Lydia McGrew is a must-read on this subject. Highly recommend that. Just to give one example quickly, of evidence for John being an eyewitness in uh, in John chapter 6 and verse 5. You have the setup for the feeding of the 5,000 miracle, and it says, um, now it says, lifting up his eyes then, seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where would you buy bread so these people may eat?" And it raises an interesting question in the mind of the audience. Why did Jesus turn to Philip here in particular? Or why not say Judas Iscariot, who's in charge of the money bag, or something like that? But when you turn over, 6 chapters later to John 12, verse 21, 22, it mentions in parenthesis that so there were some Greeks at feast of Passover who wanted to speak to Jesus, and they came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, to ask him, "Sir, we wish to see Jesus." And so we have in John 12 then this incidental detail that Philip is from the town of Bethsaida in Galilee. Now, if you go over to Luke's account in Luke chapter 9 and verse 10, Luke doesn't mention the uh, the involvement of Philip at all. And but he does mention in verse 10 that Bethsaida is the setting of the miracle story. And so by putting the pieces together, drawing information from Luke 9, which tells us that Bethsaida was the location of the event, John 6, which tells us that asked Philip, "Where do we send people to buy bread?" and John 12, which tells us that Philip was from Bethsaida. Now we have a complete explanation of why Jesus might speak to Philip in John 6:5. He's a local guy. He knows where the shops are to buy bread. And so um, that sort of artless, undesigned dovetailing or coincidence, I think supports that, and this is very, very minor detail, supports that the author was indeed someone who was close up to the facts and well informed, and in the habit of being scrupulous. Also, notice verse 4 of John 6, which tells us when the event took place. It took place at the feast of Passover. The Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. But in Mark's account, in Mark chapter 6, verse 31, it tells us that the motivation for Jesus and the disciples going to a deserted area was because it was so busy. There were crowds coming and going, so they go to a deserted area to eat. And in verse 39, it tells us that, unfortunately for them, the crowds had followed Jesus, even though they'd gone to get some peace and quiet. And Jesus commanded the crowds to sit down on the green grass. And the grass is actually not green throughout in Israel throughout most of the year, except at a relatively narrow window of time during the spring because of the higher levels of rainfall. And so and that coincides with the Jewish feast of Passover. And so in John 6, verse 4, when it tells us that Passover, the feast of the Jews was at hand, that interlocks very casually with Mark 6:31 that tells us about how busy the place was, that they had to go to find leisure to eat because it was so busy and crowded, because there would be all these Jewish pilgrims coming in for the feast of Passover, and it also illuminates why the grass is green at that particular time, because it's the right time of year. And so again, that argument is a cumulative argument drawing on numerous examples. So that's Luke and John, and then Mark. I think that it's interesting that so the internal evidences that seem to suggest the traditional authorship of the Gospels also converges with the external secular sources. Sorry, not the external secular. I mean external patristic sources. So regarding Mark, it's interesting that Justin Martyr refers to the memoirs of Peter, and he mentions two things that are in the memoirs of Peter, namely that the sons of Zebedee are called Boanerges, and Simon is called Peter by Jesus. Now, neither of those occurs in the excellent fragment we have of the so-called Gospel of Peter. Both are in Mark, and the sons of Zebedee incident is only in Mark. And so that suggests that Justin Martyr is talking about the Gospel of Mark when he talks about the memoirs of Peter. And so it's quite striking then that the later sources, like Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian of Carthage, Irenaeus of Lyon, Papias of Hierapolis, also around 125 AD, tell us that Mark's Gospel used Peter's testimony as a source. And so it's interesting that it goes from being the Gospel of Peter in Justin Martyr to being the Gospel of Mark, but he only used Peter as a source, because it's very difficult to imagine why they would do that, given that Mark is best known for his abandoning Paul and Barnabas in Pamphylia on a mission trip, and later causing this sharp split between Paul and Barnabas. It seems an unlikely choice of gospel candidate. So that's just a few of the arguments that one could deduce for gospel authorship.
Jonathan, thank you for that. The command you have over those details is impressive. And I think for a lot of people, they are baffled that they've never heard this before, that this seems to be a hidden trove of knowledge about how the early New Testament documents interlock with each other in all of these undesigned coincidences, as they're called. And so thanks for pointing us to some other literature. I found a lot of benefit from Lydia McGrew's book, Hidden in Plain View, and definitely can add my recommendation to that work as well. And the other things you've mentioned, those are some good rabbit trails for people to go down and begin to read these documents far more closely than maybe we have before and start to ask some questions and see if we can't find for ourselves whether they contradict or if they line up. Now, I think one line of skepticism about this whole project is uh, when we talk about the Gospels, we're talking about a reconstructed set of documents. That they're these ancient texts that had to get, pieced together to even give us the manuscripts that were the basis for our English translations. And so when you're looking at, reconstructed versions, we don't have the originals of the Gospels. And there's been a significant period of time, certainly from today to when they were written. And a lot of things can happen over the centuries, forgeries, mistakes, human error, things get lost, manuscripts fade away. There's a lot of reason, I think, that people have to say, I'm not sure that whatever we have in our Bibles today is what the early church was looking at. So, what do you say to that?
Yeah, so this relates to the discipline of New Testament textual criticism, which is where we look at the manuscript um, and manuscripts that have come down to us, and we compare those manuscripts to see where there are variations between the manuscripts, and where there are variations, we make judgments on which is most likely to be the oldest and original reading. And there's a number of different criteria that textual critics will use to ascertain what the original reading was. So, for example, the more difficult reading is probably the original, or more likely to be the original, because it's easier to imagine why someone would convert an awkward reading to an easier reading rather than the other way around. There are also some manuscripts that are just more reliable than others generally. And so if you have a textual variant that's present in a less reliable manuscript, then you go with a more reliable manuscript, all other things being held equal. Um, there's the earliness of the manuscript is also a factor, although not the only factor, or even necessarily the most important factor. The um, there's also so most textual critics are persuaded that we can reconstruct the vast majority of the New Testament. There's only dispute about a very small minority of the New Testament as to what the original said among New Testament textual critics. What I find to be most impressive is not so much the earliness of the manuscripts, because people often cite P52, for which people often give the dating of P52 to 125 without noting that that's the earliest possible date, and there's range that stretches all the way to perhaps 200 AD. Um, but uh, um, also, it's people often fail to mention that more than 94% of our New Testament Greek manuscripts are actually from the 9th century and later. So we have to be careful about overstating our case. What I would say though is what's more impressive than the earliness of dating is the various independent lines of transmission that we have that converge upon a common text. It would be very difficult for someone to impose a textual uniformity upon the New Testament or edit it in some way uh, deliberately, because you would have to affect all of the different independent lines of transmission that appear to converge upon this common text. So I don't think that there's much reason to doubt that what we have in the New Testament is substantially what was originally written down by the New Testament authors.
So, do you happen to have, offhand how many lines of transmission there are, or where some of the major centers of reproducing the manuscripts were, and how does that lead to the conclusion that, hey, Mark has been reconstructed accurately? Because there's another ending to Mark, and a lot of people say, hey, look, that was added later, so we actually don't need that. Some people say, hey, that's an important for our church. We cherish this ending. Why are you taking away from what we have here? I mean, when you have a whole different ending to one of the Gospels, uh, people start to ask, hey, how do we know which one we should trust?
Mm. Yeah, Mark 16, I think probably finished at verse 8. I don't think. I mean, essentially everyone agrees that verses 9 and following in Mark 16 is a later interpolation, and then scholars are divided as to whether there was an original ending of Mark that has gotten lost at some point, or whether Mark actually intended to finish in verse 8. And I tend towards the latter view, although I'm not particularly committal. I think that's where the evidence trends towards. But if you want a good book on textual criticism that gives a very good introduction and survey of the field, I recommend a book called Myths and Mistakes in New Testament Textual Criticism. That's a really excellent resource for delving into this topic. Another good book, which gives a very basic introduction to New Testament textual criticism, is Reinventing Jesus by Dan Wallace and Ed Komaszewski. That's a really excellent introduction to New Testament textual criticism as well.
Okay, thanks. It's a very complex and technical subject, and it deserves careful study. So you've argued that the undesigned coincidences bolster our confidence in the Gospels, but I think other people come at it from the point of contradictions, and they say, look, the Gospels have details that cannot be reconciled. They don't
Mm,
line up. So in Mark 11, Jesus curses a fig tree. And miraculously, the fig tree is withered the very next day.
mm,
And that's remarkable. I mean, that's clearly supernatural. If I can say, this tree is cursed and it withers and is no longer a good tree the next day, and there's not a lightning storm overnight, I mean, that's an impressive ability. I mean, I could definitely draw a crowd if that was within my capacity. So
mm,
that's something that's clearly, a miracle, saying Jesus is divine, he controls nature. That's something you would remember the rest of your life. But in Matthew, the tree withers immediately, and the disciples are amazed by how quickly it happens. Now, earlier, Jonathan, you said, look, eating a meal with Jesus, that's something you never forget. I promise you, if I was with a friend and he pointed at a specific tree and commanded it to wither and cursed it, and it did on the spot, the immediacy of that miraculous event would be, fixed for the rest of my life. And to get that wrong and say it happened overnight and we only noticed it the next day, I don't, how do you bring those two stories together?
Yeah, I don't find that to be a particularly troubling example because immediately, I mean, what does immediately mean? I mean, um, the next day seems to be fairly immediately, and I don't find that to be a particularly strong argument. A stronger argument would be that in Matthew 21, the cleansing of the temple actually seems to occur the day before the cursing of the fig tree, because in verse 17 it says, "Leaving them, he went out of the city to Bethany and lodged there. In the morning, as he was returning to the city, he became hungry," and so forth. In Mark's account, it says, uh, so you've got the cursing of the fig tree in verse 12. The following day, when they came to Bethany, he was hungry, and seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. And then it says, "And they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold," and so forth. And so then you've got the cleansing of the temple um, apparently happening after the cursing of the fig tree, and that would be one of the examples that I would say is probably an actual contradiction or discrepancy in the Gospels. And I don't think that's a particularly problematic one. I do draw a distinction between good faith errors versus deliberate distortions of fact, and I recognize that there's an epistemic difference between the two. They're not epistemically equivalent. Uh, a minor good faith mistake is not nearly as damaging to the overall substantial, even robust, strong reliability of the Gospels than a deliberate distortion of fact would be. And so I think that the temporal ordering of events or the chronology, I think, is not always something that is that might be remembered. There might be variations in eyewitness memory and that sort of thing. So And then also notice, going back to your question about the immediacy of the cursing of the fig tree. In verse 14, it says, "He said to it, 'May no one eat from you again.' And his disciples heard it." It doesn't necessarily say there that the disciples observed the fig tree withering, and so the next morning, of course, the disciples, in verse 20, as it passed by in the morning, the disciples saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. So it may well be the case that the disciples simply hadn't observed the withering of the fig tree, and they only observe it the next morning or something like that.
Okay, so let's dig in, and if you're conceding that there are good faith mistakes in the
Hmm.
Gospels, how wide does that crack go? And there are other good faith mistakes in the Gospels. The sequence of events, at the end of Jesus' ministry, and what day did different things happen in the final week of his life. There's some tensions there, right? um, and who came to the tomb first. And so if there's a multitude of good faith mistakes, doesn't that at some point begin to undermine our confidence that they got the details right?
Um, well, I think that there's only a small handful of these, and I don't think that it does undermine our confidence for the strong reliability of the Gospels, because there um, variation in eyewitness memory and circumstantial variety is not all unexpected in historical sources, even highly reliable ones. There are contradictions, for example, in eyewitness testimony concerning the sinking of the Titanic, but we don't conclude for that reason the Titanic didn't sink. And we can calibrate our expectations by looking at other sources. In fact, and the vast majority of these discrepancies between the Gospels actually, upon further inspection, do have very believable harmonizations. So, for example, you mentioned the date of Jesus' crucifixion. So, in Mark 14, verse 12, it says, "In the first day of unleavened bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to them, 'Where will you have us go and prepare for you to eat the Passover?'" And then, of course, the Last Supper ensues. In John 19:14, where it's describing the scene where Jesus is condemned to be crucified, it says, "Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover." So the argument that's often put forward is that in Mark, the Last Supper takes place on the first day of Passover. So Jesus gets arrested that night; he's crucified the next day, which is the first day of unleavened bread, as the Jews reckon days. And according to many scholars, John tells us that the crucifixion took place on the day of preparation for the Passover, so the day before the Passover. Now, John actually doesn't say that it was a day of preparation for the Passover. He says that it was a day of preparation of the Passover. And in fact, I mean, the translation preparation for the Passover is not a necessary translation of the genitive there. Preparation of the Passover is the usual translation. I think it's a permissible translation. And I think that there's good grounds contextually for thinking that this is not talking about preparation as in the day before the Passover, but rather it's the day before the Sabbath. That's what he means by preparation. Mark, in fact, uses the very same term in Mark 15:42, and he tells us what it means as well. It says, "When evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath." So, in other words, preparation means preparation for the Sabbath. Um, Now, when we read John a little more carefully, we read John 19:31. It says, "Since it was a day of preparation, so the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken, and that they might be taken away." And so John agrees with Mark that it was a day of preparation before the Sabbath. That's what he means by preparation. Um, Now, um, you might wonder, well, what does John mean when he says, "For that Sabbath was a high day"? Well, I think that he simply means that this was a particularly special feast day. It wasn't just any old Sabbath day, but it was Sabbath specifically in the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which, according to Jewish sources, was a week-long festival. Um, Now, another objection that comes up is John 18:28, which says that he led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters, so they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. And you might say, well, doesn't this contradict the claim that Passover had already taken place? But I think this actually supports my contention, not the contention that John changes the day. So as I said before, Passover is not simply one day, right? It's a whole week-long festival. Throughout the Gospel of John, in fact, the word Passover occurs 8 other times and always refers to the festival as a whole, not merely to the initial Seder that begins Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Um, so the Seder, in fact, that begins the Passover celebration is not the only ritual meal eaten during Passover. In fact, there's another ritual meal known as the Chagiga, which is eaten at midday the following day. In fact, Josephus tells us that he tells us on multiple occasions actually that the term Passover was applied to the entire Feast of Unleavened Bread, so the entire week-long occasion. And so, if here's another important consideration though that pertains to that question about the Jews being concerned about being coming defiled and not being able to consume the Passover meal. So if the chief priest had entered Pilate's dwelling and been defiled by so doing, then that defilement would expire at sundown. So they would just need to wash, they'd be good to go, they'd be able to eat the evening meal, and so there wouldn't be a problem. So they have to be concerned about something other than the evening meal. It can't have to do with the initial Seder in Passover. John's account actually fits quite well with what we have in Mark. The concern of the chief priests is not, it couldn't have been about the Passover Seder, because then their worry wouldn't make any sense. The Seder was already finished. It was eaten the previous evening. And so they have to be concerned about some other meal in Passover, which is probably the Kikio, which is eaten during the day, the day after, as we would recognize the initial Seder was eaten. Um, Now, another point that comes up in that particular discussion is John 13, verse 1, which has been taken by some to suggest that the meal at the Last Supper in John is a different meal from the Last Supper in the Synoptic Gospels. And I actually think that quite the opposite is the case. There's actually two undesigned coincidences that connect the meal eaten in John 13 with the synoptics. So in Luke 22:27, Jesus says, "For who is the greater, one who reclines at table or one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at table? But I'm among you as the one who serves." Now, what does Jesus mean by that phrase? To what could he be referring? Well, we're not told in Luke, but if you go over to John 13, verses 4 and 5, describing the same meal, it says, Jesus laid aside his outer garments, taking a towel, tied it around his waist, and he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet. And so then that illuminates and clarifies and makes sense of Jesus' statement in Luke. For who is the greater, one who reclines at table or one who serves? Is not the one who reclines at table, but I'm among you as the one who serves. In other words, even though he is the greatest among them, he is the servant among them. In fact, he stoops to the level of washing the disciples' feet, which would be the normal job of a slave or servant. Um, but then one might ask, well, why does Jesus decide to wash the disciples' feet on this particular occasion? Well, if you look at Luke 22:24, so back over in Luke's gospel, and Luke, remember, doesn't report the washing of the disciples' feet, but Luke does tell us that a dispute also arose among the disciples as to which of them was to be regarded as the greatest. So only Luke actually mentions that dispute that explains then why Jesus gave them that object lesson in servanthood by washing the disciples' feet. And so the accounts fit together exactly as you'd expect if this is talking about one and the same event, and indeed an historical event. And so I don't think that there's reason to think that the meal in John is a different meal from that in the synoptics. Now, John 13:1 tells us before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. So this often is used to argue that the Last Supper was, in fact, the Passover meal. But it doesn't actually say that the supper was before the feast. Rather, it says that before the feast, Jesus loved his disciples to the end. And it seems to me that the most face value reading of verse 2 of John 13, in view of verse 1, is that the Last Supper is indeed the Passover meal. So in John 13, verse 2, it says, during supper, when the devil had already put into the heart, during supper, supper is presumably the Passover meal alluded to in verse 1, where it says, now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. So Craig Blomberg, in fact, summarizes, he also takes this view as well. He says, this is from his book, The Historical Reliability of John's Gospel, and I'm quoting, he says, verse 1 thus stands as a headline over the entire Passion narrative, because Passover began with a supper time meal as its most central ritual. Um, uh, and 1 Corinthians 11:20 speaks of the Last Supper explicitly as a deep known. To hear then that the supper was being served in verse 2 would naturally suggest that the Passover had begun, not that this was some separate supper prior to the Passover. If there is still any doubt, as Cullen's story explains, the presence of Jesus' prediction of his betrayal, Judas' departure from the table, implicit in the Synoptics, explicit in John, the affirmation of Peter of unswerving loyalty to Jesus, and Jesus' prediction of his denial. All of these circumstances together form solid lines of connection between the meal in John 13 and the Synoptic account of the Holy Supper. Almost certainly, then, John intended his audience to understand that he was beginning to describe events that take place on Maundy Thursday night as part of the Passover meal, just as they would already have learned in the oral kerygma. So, um, I think that the most best value and interpretation of verse 2 in view of verse 1 is that the meal in question is the Passover Seder. But one might also ask about John 13:29, where it says that Judas left to go out into the night, and some thought that because Judas had the money bag, Jesus was telling him, buy what we need for the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. So does that suggest that he was being or that the disciples were speculating Jesus had Judas go to buy what they need for the Passover feast, and therefore the Last Supper is not the Passover meal? I don't think so, because as I said before, the Feast of Unleavened Bread continues for another week, which could easily be the meaning of the phrase "the feast" in this context. Um, and uh, and so I think um, that there's um, reason to think that uh, this is in fact a Passover meal. In fact, Don Carson also points out that so in this verse that we just read in John 13 about Judas Iscariot going out into the night, and the disciples speculating that perhaps he was going to give something to the poor. Giving something to the poor would be something that would be traditionally done on the night of the Passover Seder, and so that also I think supports the argument that this is in fact the Seder meal. And so, according to all four Gospels, then Jesus' crucifixion takes place on the day of Passover, the first day of unleavened bread, Nisan 15th.
Okay, that is incredible detail, Jonathan. Thank you for that. And for everyone watching, it's okay to rewind back to the start of Jonathan's answer and play it again a couple more times, going through with the Bible in front of you or using an online Bible. Go to BibleGateway.com or what have you, and follow along the argument and see all of the ways in which these documents are interlocking. If you're unfamiliar with these documents, you might have been like, whoosh, 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 that's over my head. But Jonathan, I think the point you're making is that the most exacting scrutiny of every detail and of how the Greek is constructed and of how the Jewish cultural traditions took place, all of these things fit together when we become more and more and more familiar with them. And so it's not that we need to avoid scrutiny of the Gospels. What I see you doing is welcoming the scrutiny, taking it on its own terms, and then prying deeper and deeper and deeper into the text and the cultural traditions and seeing actually this leads to a harmony, which is surprising and exciting to see time and time again. I want to throw one more objection at you, Jonathan, and I think back to conversations I had in college, and if someone asked me to recreate them, I mean, if you put up my recreation of that conversation with, if there existed a recording of that conversation, I mean, I would have gotten a lot of details wrong about it. Or I think about, I've heard some amazing sermons or talks in my life, life-changing things that altered the trajectory of my career and the decisions I made and the cities I lived in. But if you asked me to go back and say, so what was that message about? I mean, I'm not sure I could give you more than one point. And if, again, we listen to a recording of that talk, again, there would be a huge gap between my recollection 10, 15, 20 years after the fact and what was actually said. So, how can we trust that, the Sermon on the Mount isn't more of an imaginative reconstruction of what Jesus might have said, but that he actually said those particular words in that particular order? Uh, Maybe they changed out some of the stories or, embellished it in a few places to make him more eloquent than he really was. what confidence can we have that human memory is capable of recreating so many speeches that took place a decade or 2 decades or more, 40 or 50 years after the event?
We have to remember that Jesus, I mean, the culture of the first century in first century Palestine was an oral culture, and that they it's very, very plausible that Jesus would have repeated certain teachings, and the disciples would commit these teachings to memory, as you would expect the disciples to do of a rabbi that they were following. Um, and so that would, of course, would aid memory. We can also look at the direct evidence of the Gospels themselves to find out if it's quite plausible that what we have in the Gospels is, in fact, recognizable paraphrase of what Jesus, in fact, said on various occasions. So one line of evidence that bears on this is what I call artless similarities, which refers to the casual consistency with which a character is portrayed across the different episodes involving the character and across the four Gospels. So this argument was first put forward also by William Paley, and he gives various examples to support this argument. And he notes in his A View of the Evidence of Christianity, he says, the article in which I find this agreement most strong is in our Saviour's mode of teaching, and in that particular property of it, which consists in drawing of his doctrine from the occasion, or which is nearly the same thing, raising reflections from the object and incidents before him, or turning a particular discourse, then passing it into an opportunity of general instruction. So, so to take the examples of Jesus' habit of drawing doctrine from the occasion, consider, for instance, Matthew 12, 46 through 50, where it says, while he was still speaking to the people, behold, his mother and his brothers stood outside, asking to speak to him. But he replied to the man who told him, who is my mother, and who are my brothers? And stretching out his hand toward the disciples, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. Um, and so Jesus there uses the occasion to from which to draw his teaching. Another example of that is in Matthew 16, 5 through 7. When the disciples reached the other side, they had forgotten to bring any bread. Jesus said to them, watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Matthew 15 says, then Pharisees and scribes came to Jesus from Jerusalem and said, why do your elders break the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat. And he called the people to him and said to them, hear and understand. It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles the person, but what comes out of the mouth. This defiles the person. So again, drawing doctrine from the occasion. Mark 10, 13 through 15. They were bringing children to him that he might touch them, and the disciples rebuked them. And when Jesus saw it, he was indignant, and said to them, let the children come to me, and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of God. Truly I say to you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God like a child shall not enter it. Again, so drawing doctrine from the occasion. Mark 1, verse 16 and 17, it says, passing alongside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, follow me, and I will make you become fishers of men. Again, using his surroundings from which to draw lessons. Um, or so there's various examples of that particular phenomenon. Another example is in John 4, 12 through 14, where Jesus is in dialogue with the woman at the well, and she says, are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock. Jesus said to her, everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water, welling up to eternal life. Or in John, or that same chapter in verse 31 through 34. Meanwhile, the disciples were urging him, saying, Rabbi, eat. But he said to them, I have food to eat that you do not know about. So the disciples said to one another, has anyone brought him something to eat? Jesus said to them, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. And so again, you see him drawing doctrine from the occasion and from his surroundings. Or in John 9, 1 through 5, as he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. So again, drawing doctrine from the occasion. There's many other examples of this. So William Paley summarizes, he says, all that the reader has now to do is to compare the series of examples taken from John with the series of examples taken from the other evangelists, and to judge whether there be not a visible agreement of manner between them. In the above quoted passages, the occasion is stated as well as the reflection. They seem therefore the most proper for the purpose of our argument. A large, however, and curious collection has been made by different writers of instances in which it is extremely probable that Christ spoke in allusion to some object or some occasion, then before him, though the mention of the occasion or of the object be omitted in the history. I only observe that these instances are common to St. John's Gospel with the other three. Um, there's also other categories of this. So, for example, take Jesus' tendency to turn away compliments. So in John 3, verses 2 and 3, for example, it says, This man came to Jesus by night, speaking about Nicodemus, and said to him, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do these things, these signs that you do, unless God is with him. Jesus answered him, Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. And the reader is left there wondering, where did that come from? Jesus turns away this compliment and kind of changes the topic. Matthew 8, 19 and 20. Notice that, and again, different gospel, different episode, completely different pericope. A scribe came up and said to him, Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. And Jesus said to him, Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And the reader, again, is like, well, where did that come from? Luke 11, 27 and 28. As he said these things, a woman in the crowd raised her voice and said to him, Blessed is the womb that bore you, and the breasts at which you nursed. But he said, Blessed rather are those who hear the word of God and keep it. Or Mark 10, 17 and 18. And as he was setting out on his journey, a man ran up and knelt before him and asked him, Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus said to him, Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. So you can see Jesus' tendency to turn away compliments. Um, there's lots of other examples of this sort of thing across the four gospels, but the artless similarities of those statements of Jesus, the way that you see the common character portrayals across the four gospels in very very subtle ways, I think supports that what we have in the gospels actually does reflect Jesus' own teachings and sayings.
That's very interesting that from very different perspectives, different people, different life experiences, different purposes in writing, but the way in which they portray Jesus as responding to a similar kind of circumstance or prompt feels it has that same ring to it, and you get the sense
Right.
this is the same person. And that's something we're accustomed to in everyday life. I mean, when I get together with my siblings and we tell stories about our mom or our dad, we may have not been there for those stories, but it's like, oh yeah, that's just how mom is, isn't it?
Right.
And it's the description of the person that we all know and can recognize. So, Jonathan, let's say you were writing a book, and maybe I'm putting a little, encouragement here for you. Let's say you're writing a book called "Why I Think the Gospels Are True." What are your chapter titles? What are the main lines of argument that you would summarize for us and send us off into further exploration? What are the main categories by which you've come to the conclusion that the Gospels are giving us a truthful picture of God becoming human, living among us, dying on the cross, and rising from the dead? What leads you to say, yeah, that's what happened?
Yeah, so there would be essentially seven lines of argument that I would adduce for Christianity. One would be the resurrection of Jesus, which I outlined the case in skeletal form earlier. Another argument would be the trilemma argument, which argues that there's very compelling reason to believe that Jesus actually claimed divine status. He claimed to be the God of Israel incarnate. And that being the case, one of two things is true. Either he was right or he wasn't. And if he wasn't, he either knew he wasn't or he didn't. And the fact that Jesus gets himself crucified on account of that testimony goes a long way towards establishing that he was at least sincere in holding that belief. And there's a very small reference class of individuals that can be honestly mistaken about being the creator of the universe and the God of Israel incarnate. And so, and Jesus doesn't seem to fit that reference class. And so that tends to move the needle in the direction of Christianity. Another argument would be the argument for messianic prophecy, which is to say that that there's various lines of prophecies in the Hebrew text, the Hebrew Bible, which point to Jesus as being the Messiah of Israel. An example of that would be, so Isaiah 53 verses 1 and 2 tells that Messiah was supposed to be cut off, was supposed to be rejected by his own people. And that's not particularly surprising. Most prophets were at some point. But given that he was cut off, given that he was rejected by his own people, it's surprising then that according to Isaiah 42:6 and Isaiah 49:6, the Messiah was supposed to nonetheless bring representatives of all nations to recognize the God of Israel. Now, who but Jesus has accomplished that feat? And so that's something that's surprising. And so it provides confirming evidence. It's far less surprising if he really is the Messiah than it would be if he's not. Jesus' birth in Bethlehem would be another example, fulfilling Micah 5 verse 2. We have good evidence for the reliability of the nativity narratives. Also, the fact that Jesus' death coincides with the Jewish feast of Passover is also a striking coincidence, given the theological import of that, with Jesus being the fulfillment of the Passover lamb imagery. And so forth. So you can build that sort of argument cumulatively. Another argument would be the conversion of the Apostle Paul. I argue and have argued at length that Acts 9 actually reflects the testimony of Paul himself as to his conversion experience, and that being the case, then he was either lying, he was honestly mistaken, or he was right. And if you look at Paul's sufferings and his willingness to face persecution, especially in 2 Corinthians 12 and read about it in Philippians, um, First Thessalonians, and the pastorals, and First Clement, the Book of Acts, it's Paul was willing to suffer and be imprisoned and be whipped and tortured on account of his testimony that Jesus had actually appeared to him on the road to Damascus. And so that suggests strongly that he was at least sincere. And his experience seems to be somewhat veridical. It's a multi-sensory experience. It doesn't just involve a visual component where there's a bright light from heaven, but also an auditory component. He hears a voice speaking to him, introducing himself as Jesus of Nazareth, whom he is being persecuting. It also seems to have some sort of sensory experience on some sort of sensory effect on his traveling companions, who also hear the voice. And and also Paul is blinded by the experience, and he actually gets healed by Ananias later. And Paul also seems to have had miraculous abilities. In 2 Corinthians 12, he mentions the signs of a true apostle performed in your midst. He also mentions miraculous abilities in Romans 15. So um, that suggests that that Paul believed that the Corinthians were sufficiently persuaded of Paul's miraculous abilities that they could vouch for that when he appealed to it to authenticate his apostolic credentials. And so, even if it's not sufficient on its own to establish Christianity, it does tend to move the needle quite significantly in that direction. So it can factor into this broader cumulative argument. Then you've also got the argument from contemporary miracles. So Craig Keener, Robert Larmer, and Lee Strobel and others have written about this topic of contemporary miracles, and not all of them are convincing or equally well documented, but there's enough there that it seems to me to be fairly compelling. And uh, and uh, and another argument would be the survival of the nation of Israel against all odds, given the numerous attempts that um, have been the numerous times that there's been attempts made to exterminate the Jewish people. The fact that they have survived and rebounded from those attempts is surprising. It's certainly less surprising on the hypothesis that the God of Israel exists. We think about the Assyrian invasion against Judah, led by Sennacherib during the days of Hezekiah. You've got the Babylonian invasion later, the Babylonian exile, and then you've got the Persian conquest of Babylon, and you've got Haman during the days of Esther that tried to exterminate the Jewish people, and then you've got 100 in the second century, and like in the 160s, you've got Antiochus Epiphanes, who um, who tried to abolish Judaism and oppress the Jewish people, and kind of the Adolf Hitler of the ancient world, if you will, and Judas Maccabeus famously led a revolt against Antiochus Epiphanes and was outnumbered and outgunned and yet succeeded victoriously. And then, of course, you've got the the Roman siege of Jerusalem between 66 and 70, under Titus, the son of the Emperor Vespasian, culminating in the destruction of the temple in AD 70. And then, you, of course, got um, the uh, the Jewish Holocaust in the 20th century. So, in spite of all of those attempts to annihilate the Jewish people and stamp out Judaism and and so forth, the Hebrew people has retained their national identity and has survived despite all of those odds. And again, it's not conclusive evidence for the God of Israel existing, but it's certainly less surprising on that hypothesis, and so it tends to move the needle in that direction, contributing to that broader cumulative argument.
Well, Jonathan, thank you so much. I'm going to have a link to Jonathan's website in the description under this video so you can click through and dive into some of his long form articles where he will examine an issue in the same kind of careful and precise depth that you've heard him articulate on today's program. And I'll also have a link to talkaboutdoubts.com. And if you feel that I've gone soft or taken it easy on Jonathan, haven't pressed back enough times with further objections that are still challenging you, and you're feeling, that was helpful, but I've got 10 more questions. I need to talk about this for 20 more hours. Please go to talkaboutdoubts.com and register for a free consultation, and you will be treated with respect and dignity and kindness, and it will be okay and acceptable to have doubts in that environment. That's the whole point, is to talk about doubts. And if you want to process this conversation in an international community of men and women from all around the world, different vocations and lifestyles and all kinds of things, go to uncommonpursuit.net. I'll have a link to that. Create a free account, and you can come and discuss this program with us. And we would love to have you be transformed by God so that you can be an active participant in God's mission. And I'm confident that a careful listen to this program is going to have you be far more prepared to talk about the evidence for Christianity and just give you encouragement as you pick up the Gospels that you're reading something that is eyewitness testimony, that is truthful and accurate, and that is giving you access to what it was like when God was man in the person of Jesus Christ. So, Jonathan, thank you for being on today. It's been an absolute pleasure to have this conversation with you. And to everyone who's listened this far, thank you so very much. We hope you'll join us again next time.